Hello readers, I'm the avid reader and today we're reviewing Black Rednecks and White Liberals, written by Thomas Sowell in 2005. So Thomas Sowell is an economist, but he doesn't just write economics books. He writes a lot of sociology and history, and this is one of the most popular ones, which is Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and it's a collection of 6 essays on history and sociology of different groups. So a general theme is on black people, history linked to that. There's talk about slavery, but there's also chapters on Germans and Jews, and the final chapter discusses the role of history, kind of. It is oddly a history book, I would say, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. So there are 6 chapters, and the first chapter, of course, is Black Rednecks and White Liberals. So Thomas Sowell explains that the redneck culture is decadent and that it is characterized by pride, which leads to violence. Instead of settling their problems in court, they go duke it out, or they challenge each other to a duel. So people fight to the death often when the problem should be solved peacefully. And people are reckless, take a lot of dumb risks, and they are often lazy. So for example, even if the South had some very good farmland, the best farmers were Germans and other ethnic groups immigrating there. Dairy products were actually produced from northern farmers instead of southern farmers, even though southern farmers had the climatic advantage. So you have a lack of economic activity in a sense in the South, and that's poverty. This redneck culture in the South was embedded onto blacks. So 1/3 of whites lived in the South, while I think 4/5 or something like that of blacks, 90% of them, they lived in the South. So the so-called ghetto culture originated from the American South, which originated in Britain, in the borderlands between Scotland and England, and also towards northern Britain, while the colonies of New England, which are more developed, more religious, more moral, came from southeastern England. So you can see how a large part of migration came from concentrated amount of communities, and that when the communities that were decadent in Scotland and northern England, they came to the United States before they reformed. So that is why you have a redneck, lazy culture. Now in the South that has evolved, but a lot of these southern blacks who got the redneck culture, they immigrated to the city, which made things worse for blacks in the North. And Thomas Sowell points out that there were actually free blacks before there were slaves, so you always had a minority of blacks in the United States who were free. They themselves sometimes owned slaves. These free blacks, sometimes they were well educated, and there's talk about these New England enclaves in the South. So the blacks who got New England culture actually dealt pretty well with the legacy of slavery. So you've got kind of 2 classes of blacks. You've got them with the redneck culture, and then you've got those who went to these New England style schools, for example in Washington DC, who actually had higher IQs and earned quite a good income and got good grades. And the second part of that title is White Liberals, and basically it's about how white liberals in the United States support this ghetto culture and talk about innate blackness while this culture originated in Britain. And when trying to discuss problems, these intellectuals try to discredit people and blame others for problems of the blacks. So a lot of black community problems are caused by blacks themselves instead of external factors. So internal factors are often more important than external ones. The second chapter is on Jews, but also on Middleman Minorities. So Jews are the most prominent of the Middleman minorities, and they are those who facilitate development and commerce. So for example, retailers or shopkeepers, people like that, such as the Koreans in the United States, or the Lebanese in Sierra Leone, the Indians and Pakistanis in East Africa, the Chinese in the Southeast Asia, they developed these societies quite well. They brought new industries to these places, so they did not take over them. And Thomas Sowell kind of explains anti-Semitism here, that a lot of this hate towards Jews and other minorities comes from that they are successful, as are the Lebanese in West Africa, the Chinese in Southeast Asia, or the Indians in East Africa. All these groups have been persecuted by different types of governments because they were successful, and the demagogues misled the masses into hating them. And middlemen minorities, they often start out poor but become quite rich quite rapidly because they work very hard. So they may work 12 hours a day, for example. They have close family ties, so there are some social prerequisites, and they value education a lot, but education is a benefit from their hard work, not the other way around. And Thomas Sowell also explains that there's no such thing as just the Jewish people, for example, that these different groups were divided among themselves often. So for example, the Lebanese, there you've got divisions among the Christians, the Shia Muslims, and the Sunni Muslims, and often the divisions between different people were from where they came from, certain communities. So you got the Eastern European Jews, for example, and the German Jews, and the German Jews dislike the Eastern European Jews. The third chapter is the real history of slavery. So there's a myth that slavery was a Western concept that was mostly carried out by the Americans. That's not true. So Thomas Sowell explains that slavery is one of the world's oldest institutions. Slavery came before race. It was later on that the Europeans got the capacity to enslave Africans, and that you had Arabs who enslaved a lot of Africans and Europeans themselves. And it was actually the West who helped stop slavery because they developed the morality and the ethics to stop them. So the British spent a lot of money in the 19th century on their navy to destroy slavery in their colonies and in the Atlantic Ocean. And slavery in some ways was a much bigger problem in the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf than on the Atlantic Ocean, because on the Atlantic Ocean you've got a bunch of nations who want to destroy slavery, while on the other side of the coast where you've got the Ottomans, they don't really care about slavery, and they just banned slavery, these non-Western society, from Western pressure. So you wanna know what ended slavery? In large part the British. And there's also an explanation that there is some nuance with the slavery issue in the United States, that there are different myths surrounding it. So for example, the reason why some people owned slaves was because of tradition or because of the laws in the States. So if it was illegal to emancipate your slaves, you couldn't do it, and hopefully you could do it when you died. And Thomas Sowell also talks about how these abolitionists, they were counterproductive and antagonized a lot of whites, and there was a fear of a race war. So a lot of people took it slowly with trying to end slavery to get rid of it over time, and that's why you were able to get rid of slavery during the American Civil War, instead of getting rid of it later if you hadn't had compromises that created the United States. So basically it's a question between the moral principles or the moral choices that people have available. You can have all these principles, sure, but sometimes you have a limited amount of choices. The fourth chapter is on Germans and their history, and Thomas Sowell argues there's nothing innately German with this genocide, and that Germans weren't really aware of the Holocaust. Hitler was anti-Semitic, but Germans themselves weren't really that anti-Semitic. There weren't a lot of Jews in Germany, so they were more indifferent to them. And they did not support Kristallnacht, and they did not really take part of the Jewish boycott. And Germans were quite cosmopolitan in the Habsburg Empire, for example. Germany is a Central European country, so that makes it that it's less developed than Western Europe previously, but more developed than Eastern Europe. And later they become more developed in different skills, so they immigrated to different countries in the Americas or these European offshoot nations like Australia, where they developed some industries. So they also have a work ethic, and they really stressed education. So German communities, which came from specific towns, by the way, not the German nation as a whole, they welcomed in the Jews that came to America, for example, if they were German Jews. And Germany pre-Hitler was actually quite good for Jews compared to Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe historically has been more anti-Semitic than Germany until that horrible 12 years of Hitler, you could say. And Sowell also talks about how you got these Volksdeutsche previously in Eastern Europe. The reason they collaborated with Hitler was because of the discrimination they lived during the interwar period. So Germans integrated quite well into societies where the people were indifferent to them and they were allowed to practice their culture, like the Anglophone nations. While in Eastern Europe, where they were more discriminated against, such as in Czechia, they were antagonized, and this was what made them collaborate with the Nazis later on. So here the important lesson is that genocide can happen against any group, from any people. Remember, you had the Armenian genocide by the Ottomans just 3 decades previously, and you've had a lot of genocides throughout history, so there's nothing specifically German of genocide. That's the important lesson of this chapter. The fifth chapter is on black education. Thomas Sowell talks about the achievements of blacks in Dunbar High School, that it is not true that blacks will innately fail in different school environments, that they have disadvantages. Sowell explains that if put into the right school system and you pick the right kids, they will actually succeed quite well. The school system, instead of the parents, are much more important to the development of intellectual ideas for blacks and for work ethic and things like that. But unfortunately, the ghetto culture makes having good grades acting white. So you've got this racial fetish by these white liberals who say that this is just some special black culture, while instead you've got the New England type of blacks who are succeeding in school, and then you've got the black rednecks who are destroying for society, and you've got these criminals who are being defended by some who are making it worse for everyone. And then he talks also about colleges, and if you look into the history of that, they were failures, these different black colleges, because instead of instituting skill, hiring white teachers who already have the prerequisites for the skills of universities, they hired blacks who didn't really have any experience, who didn't really care for intellectual ideas, who barely read any books. So a lot of the black education went badly, and these different things created by the government made everything worse. And the final chapter discusses history versus visions. So a lot of people who have a certain vision of things view history from the perspective of one side. They take a side. They disregard facts when it does not suit them. So they don't want to look into things if these facts will reveal some things that they don't feel comfortable with. And Thomas Sowell explains in history, you've got causation, not necessarily morality, but some things happen because of A. Not because A is good, but sometimes bad things happen, and sometimes you are in constrained situations, so you do what you do with your moral choices that are limited. And he also discusses the role model myth, where he argues that blacks don't really need a role model to succeed in life. I mean, the Japanese Americans, when they came to America, they were taught by white teachers, and they succeeded in university in different fields despite not having previous Japanese Americans having done so. So you don't need a role model of your race or your gender to succeed. It's more a work ethic thing and a culture of education. So a lot of these things have internal explanations instead of external ones. And also he reminds us that it wasn't just the West that conquered the world, but that they succeeded most well. The reason some tribes may not have liked losing war against whites is because they don't like losing. It's not that they were opposed to war. So a lot of the morality that people have now did not exist previously, including for non-Western societies, or should I say more, especially for non-Western societies. So the morality of that final chapter is don't take sides, look at the facts and see what you can learn from history, so that we don't repeat those horrible mistakes in the future or commit new ones. So that's a lot of the content in Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and there's a lot more, but there's so much that I can discuss it all. So how would I rate Black Rednecks and White Liberals? I would give it a 9 out of 10. And there are some minor facts of history I don't really like he puts in. I mean, I read a lot of history, so I know some of the things he says here are not completely correct, but he's mostly generally on the spot. Makes a lot of good points. He really makes you think. A lot of great points. So he explains well why Jews succeed. He explained German history well. He explained the state of blacks in different senses, in education, in the cities. He explained the role of history, and this amalgamates into a great book, a 9 out of 10. It's a great history book if you want to learn about American culture and its history, especially from a black perspective, but also from a minority-oriented Jewish or German perspective. So you could say about 4 of these chapters talk a lot about blacks. So you want to learn about black history from a nuanced perspective, you read Black Rednecks and White Liberals. I know this book title may seem a bit negative, but once you read it, you'll understand the title. You'll understand what a redneck actually is. So it's a great book. I think it's different from Thomas Sowell economics books, but it makes you think about society a lot and how you should deal in politics and society. So a great book, 9 out of 10. Thomas Sowell, as always, you write great books. So this was the avid reader's review of Black Rednecks and White Liberals, written by Thomas Sowell in 2005. It got a 9 out of 10. I hope you readers enjoyed this book review, and I will see you readers next time.